This is WXOJLP Northampton, 103.3 FM, your Valley Free radio station. Welcome. I'm Warren Odess-Gillette, and this is A Baha'i Perspective. A Baha'i Perspective is a radio program that presents a Baha'i perspective on life through interviews. If you want information specifically on the Baha'i faith, you're welcome to visit the website www.baha'i.org. That's BAHAI.org. Or you can call the toll-free number 1-800-22-UNITE. Today I'm playing a telephone interview with Heather Cardin, a Baha'i and author of the book Partners in Spirit: What Couples Say About Marriages That Work. We also find out in the interview that she is a poet and has other works in the pipeline for publication. I started the interview by asking Heather where she grew up and what was it like growing up there.
I grew up mostly in eastern Canada. My parents started out in the Maritime provinces, but my father's work took him first to Ontario and then to western Quebec. So from the time I was 8 until I was probably 17, I lived in eastern Canada, actually in the city that I have now come back to after 25 or more years of absence.
And what city is that?
I live in Gatineau, Quebec. Mm-hmm. Really, it's the Ottawa Valley region of Canada. Our capital is literally 10 minutes down the highway from our house, but there's a river that goes through which separates two provinces, not unlike in the States. I visited Louisiana, in Kentucky one time, and Indiana. I think you cross a bridge and you go from Kentucky to Indiana in about 10 minutes, you know.
Sure.
So it's very similar here.
Mm-hmm. You grew up in this area through elementary school, secondary school?
Yes, I graduated from high school here. Mm-hmm. And then went on to a first year at university, which didn't go overly well.
Now, why didn't it go so well?
I probably was a little young. I was 16.
Mm-hmm. 16, starting college?
Yes.
Now, why was that?
The way the system works here, it still works that way here to some degree. Kids graduate out of what's grade 11, which would be a grade 12, except that there's an interim college level, and in the time that I was graduating, if you had good marks, you could get admission directly to universities, so I did. I skipped the college for the university, and that would have been all right. There were some subjects I was stronger in than others.
And what were those subjects?
I'm a very good English major.
Yeah. So how long were you in college?
Well, I just did a year.
Mm-hmm. Did you grow up as a Baha'i?
I did.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about your parents' background, of how they found out about the Baha'i faith, and what was it like growing up as a Baha'i?
Okay. My father and my mother, respectively, were living in Toronto in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And there are lots of family stories about this, but for my mother, her sister went to live in the United States in the Washington area and met a Persian man whose name was Ali Kuli Khan, who was relatively well known to the Baha'is of the area, and he shared the Baha'i teachings with my aunt, who then went home to Toronto to visit, and they were 5 children in the family, 4 of them daughters, and all 4 of the daughters decided to embrace the Baha'i teachings in the early 1950s. Mm-hmm. At the same time, my father encountered one of the early Baha'is in Canada, but Mr. John Robart's sons were my father's classmates, and they had encountered the Baha'i faith previously. So they and another classmate, in fact, several classmates from that era, encountered the Baha'i faith and started going to what we call firesides. Mm-hmm. My father describes actually the process by which he came into the Baha'i faith, and my mother did, and they thus met in Toronto in 1953, I think, And this process is somewhat described in the book, so I won't go into it. But
Sure.
they fell in love, and they got married, and I grew up the eldest of 6 Baha'i children, all of whom have chosen in our adult lives to remain practitioners of the Baha'i faith. So I have a lot of Baha'i relatives with cousins and aunts and uncles and nieces and sisters and a lot of people around, mostly Canada and the States, who practice the Baha'i faith.
I see. And what was it like being a Baha'i in a culture that was not so prevalently Baha'i?
Well, I think we were considered a little unusual, which for me wasn't too difficult because I like being a little unusual, I suppose.
Okay.
But for my second sister, it was more difficult because she, I think, was more comfortable in trying to be a little bit more conforming. And so being a Baha'i in some ways, it was a little weird for people to hear about. And on the other hand, we were quite enriched because part of the Baha'i teachings, of course, is this oneness of people from all over the world. And my parents at the time were serving on what is called the International Pioneer Committee of the Baha'is of Canada. I believe there's an equivalent in the United States.
And what is that?
Well, where people offer to go to different regions of the world to support the Baha'is there or to support the Baha'i teaching process there. And so my parents were part of the committee that fielded these requests, which meant that we had people traveling through our home from all walks of life and from around the world, so we had, in a sense, an international upbringing because of my parents' adherence to the Baha'i teachings. It was really rich, actually. It was lovely. It led to, I think, a certain internationalism, or a sense of internationalism, probably from a young age, which was not particularly politicized, and that I have found quite valuable in my adult life and have traveled quite a bit as a result myself.
You had mentioned earlier that after your year of college, you went pioneering yourself.
I did. I went to some French islands, which are somewhat anomalous. They're called Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon. I already spoke some French, but I felt like I should learn it more fluently. And France still has colonial holdings here and there. And these very small islands are actually off to the southern tip of Newfoundland. So I went there and I spent 14 months. And there's no missionaries per se in the Baha'i faith, so you have to make a living. So I worked there. And at the time I was able to do that. I think they have stricter laws now, which probably don't allow non-French citizens to do that. And it was a really good way to grow up, to, those very crucial years when you're 17, 18, 19 and deciding what you want to do with your life. And so I came out of the Saint-Pierre experience having talked with many people about the Baha'i faith, and in fact one of those people later herself chose to declare her faith in Baha'u'llah and is the first ever Saint-Pierre to become a Baha'i, and she still practices her faith, although she's not still in Saint-Pierre. But it was really a lot of mentorship for me, I think, from people who were there, and having another language, of course, is always a blessing. So then, by that time, I met a person I really liked, and he didn't live there. So, and my parents also, by this time, had moved to Saskatchewan, and I had never been to the Prairie Provinces. So I went to the Prairie Provinces and worked for a while and then went back to school.
Now, what kind of work did you do when you went pioneering?
Oh, waitressing, hotel cleaning, tutoring English to the sons and daughters of gendarmes, who are the French police force. Pretty much, I think I enjoyed working in a boutique at one point where I sold French perfume. It was pretty eclectic. Many people at that age do just about anything they can find, don't they?
Yeah.
As long as it's legal and moral and something. Yeah.
Yeah. And what about when you returned?
To Canada, I worked as a doctor's office receptionist until I could go back to school, and then all through university, of course, I also worked in the library mostly. That took a few years because I got 2 degrees at that time. I completed a Bachelor of Arts and then subsequently went straight into a Bachelor of Education.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, right away out of university, I met my husband,
Mm-hmm.
and we got married in 1984, I guess it was, and very quickly thereafter, I went to my first teaching position, and since then I've been teaching, not nonstop, but pretty consistently for almost 20 years.
Mm-hmm. And what age group?
High school,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
High school English?
Mostly English, but I also have done senior history, something called expressive arts, visual arts, some drama, some French, of course. French is very helpful for getting a job in Canada. I imagine the same for Spanish in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I don't do math. I just don't. But anything else, they could, you have to be fairly broadly educated in high schools these days, and I do have a good background in the humanities in general.
Mm-hmm.
English literature.
Now, what do you like about teaching high school?
Well, what I liked most when I was still there, because I'm kind of casual now, and I've just received a position that I'll start in January. I'll actually be teaching at a university here rather than high school, so that's a change for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the thing about high school that I liked the most was the kids. Obviously, most teachers will tell you that, but I think those of us who stay in the teaching profession a long time just find that the delight of seeing a student or having an opportunity to work with a student where the lights go on and they get it, and for an English teacher, it's the writing process, seeing the improvements, having fun together, just getting to know each other a little bit. I have been considered to be a somewhat creative teacher. I integrate the arts a lot into even standardized types of things, so I had a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can you give me an example
Of
incorporating the arts with your teaching?
Oh, sure. One of the things that I've done in a few schools is when you're studying a particular poet or passage from literature, rather than just trying to memorize it or talk about it, I would ask students things like, how would you express this visually, and can you integrate it into a project? And then we would do all kinds of things with multimedia, and in fact, in some schools, you can still go and there'll be these great large mosaics on the wall that are integrating visual arts with literature. Quite lovely.
Mm.
I think that if a person is allowed to develop that creative self within, it can manifest in so many different ways. And so my job, in a sense, was to find out how that would express itself for a given student in the most interesting ways possible.
Mm-hmm.
Baha'u'llah who is the founder of our faith, refers to education as the process of, quote, mining gems. And I guess I always thought of it that way, that I wasn't so much, I guess in the terms of the jargon, I'm not much of a teacher-centered teacher, although clearly I do like to speak. But I really enjoyed integrating what is thought of as student-centered learning into the classrooms, and particularly nowadays, I think because of systems, classes are often an hour or an hour and a quarter long, when we know pedagogically that many people don't have an attention span longer than about 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. So you have to do something after that initial 20 minutes that's really engaging, mm-hmm. whether it's conversation. Sometimes people rely a little on video, but I'm not a strong advocate of use of video in the classroom because there's so much video out of the classroom that I think it's easy to become desensitized.
Mm.
So if you get me started on education, I can go on for a really long time.
Yeah. How many years were you teaching?
Almost 20, and I still have my foot in the door, so I'm not sure how many it's going to be by the time all is said and done. But I had 3 kids in that time, and so when I was having my children, it would tend to be more part-time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I guess the first time I ever walked into a classroom as a paid teacher was the year after I graduated because they had a shortage of supply teachers, so I actually supply taught in my old school. And then when I went to Papua New Guinea, I walked into classrooms with 40 kids, and I would have been, 21, and I'm now 50. So it's been a while.
So when did you go to Papua New Guinea?
I went from 1978 to 1981 as a CUSO, which is our Canadian equivalent of your Peace Corps.
Mm-hmm. So this was before you were married?
Yes.
Uh-huh. And tell me about your experience there at Papua New Guinea.
Well, I started on the coast in a city called Madang, and it was actually a mission school run by Catholic priests. So that was really interesting. And I think I should tell you that at that time I was just beginning to shape my own sense of feminism and how I could integrate what I was learning from the women's movement with what I already knew as a Baha'i woman trying to articulate the equality of women with men as a principle. And so that was kind of interesting to be in a little bit of an anachronistic situation, certainly male-dominated, and I ended up doing a number of things under the guise of what was called expressive arts, like teaching the boys to cook, for example. Mm-hmm. Now, technically that wasn't on the curriculum, but when you're living in what we used to call a third world country, and some people still do, there's a lot of room for maneuvering. Sometimes the curriculum can be a guideline rather than a set-in-stone thing. So for that first year in Madang, I was teaching certainly English as a second language, English literature, and expressive arts. And then I transferred to a school in the Highlands, which was 7,000 feet above sea level, so a little cooler. Not a tropical coastal paradise, but quite... When you think of Papua New Guinea, you tend to think of, those images in National Geographic. Mm-hmm. And I think that they're pretty accurate. So, you'd be driving along and having to stop or dodge tribal warfare and so forth. And I actually, when I'm not writing Baha'i works, I write a lot of creative nonfiction and poetry. And those years in Papua New Guinea have found their way into the poems and creative nonfiction. And one of my stories talks about a real event, which was that one of the students ran in for tremendous amounts of distance. There's no such thing as a school bus in such a place. So they'd learn to run to school regardless of the weather. And one boy had cut his foot running in, and the school nurse tried to sew it up for him, and his foot was so tough it broke the needle. She just couldn't sew it. It was quite a dramatic example of how it is to teach in a place where all of your expectations and assumptions have to disappear. I mean, the school buildings themselves were thatch hut. No flooring. There are stories about fleas. Fleas lived there, and I would be teaching and trying to say something, and it was always kind of fun for the students and I to see how far the fleas could get before you'd catch them. And once I got so carried away, one made it all the way up to my chest before I got him and squished him. And some weird things, I suppose, but it sounds esoteric, but in fact, what I found there, as in every place that I have taught, was that the principles of the Baha'i faith in terms of the oneness of humanity were simply true once you got beyond the facts of, here's this tall Canadian woman who sings a lot and waddles like a cassowary type of thing. Then you get beyond that, and all of a sudden these people all around you who have such an extraordinarily different background are true friends, really special and wonderful people, and lots of good memories.
That's sweet. And you left because your term with the nonprofit organization completed?
It ended, and it was time to go, yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you had mentioned something about a new position in January?
Yeah, I just got offered it.
Okay.
I'll be doing sessional work.
Mm-hmm.
at a university here. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Mm-hmm. Now, you wrote a book called Partners in Spirit, What Couples Say About Marriages That Work.
Yes, I did.
Now, what inspired you to write this book?
My parents.
Oh, tell me about that.
Well, I should say that, and probably, of course, having worked with young people for a very long time, people generally seem to have a very dark view of the institution of marriage. And I have 3 kids myself, the eldest is now 21, my youngest is 16, and, you have these family discussions about the institution of marriage, and certainly my husband and I have tried to model a good marriage for our kids, but I'd say 50% or more of the kids I was teaching almost couldn't believe it was possible to sustain a long-term relationship in any positive way because that wasn't their experience because of so many divorces. And I started thinking about it and realizing that almost every piece of literature, not all, but if you're going to read about it, there's a lot about divorce. You go into any store that sells books or television programs, there is a lot of grief. And my parents, they've now been married for 51 years. They really like each other. Mm. They really love each other. They're funny. They have great family stories, and I grew up with that. Mm-hmm. And I thought, maybe it would be of value to make a book for people that's heartening, that find out, that gives some examples of what does work rather than what does not work. So I just started talking to people and asking around, how long have you been married and what do you think are some of the things that have helped you to be married that long? And it was fascinating. I know how to do the academic thing, but I wasn't interested in doing that. I was really just interested in narratives. And it started to develop, and I thought, this is kind of working. And so I put together, took a little while because it's not an easy thing to talk about sometime, and in fact, for people who read this book, I think they'll be surprised by the level of openness and honesty about the challenges in marriages as well. I mean, there are people who talked to me in my book about challenges with HIV, challenges with the loss of their children, challenges with alcoholism, all kinds of the normal social things that we deal with. But what I found interesting is that these very normal people oftentimes used faith or consultation or some mechanism by which they just toughed it out. Very few of the people I talked to found being married easy, but all of them were very committed to being married to each other and staying married, and some of them had been previously married and it hadn't worked, so there were stepchildren involved in some of the marriages. It was just really rich, again, for me to hear the stories. So gradually the book built itself, really.
Mm-hmm. And what's the significance of the title, Partners in Spirit?
Well, there is a very strong spiritual foundation to Baha'i marriage and probably many marriages, although I can't speak about that because I'm not in one and I didn't talk to a lot of people who didn't have a spiritual foundation. And it's probably the ultimate partnership to make a commitment to somebody for the rest of your life and beyond, according to Baha'i teaching. I think that one of the things I like about the stories from the people who shared in Partners in Spirit is that on the one hand, there certainly is a spiritual underpinning for many of them, and how that translated in practice was sometimes really quite practical, prosaic. And the other side of it is it's not very esoteric. There's a lot of the stories there are really about, as one of the people says, being in the trenches, so that there's as with most of the things that I find in the Baha'i faith, a certain idealism, marriage, if you'll pardon the verb, to pragmatism. I like that, because I'm in a marriage, and that's how I find it myself. Is certainly, my husband and I share, I think, a spiritual longing and desire, and we have an independent life in prayer and practice. But you also have to pay the mortgage, raise the children, decide what's for dinner, all of those kinds of things. And how do you do those things on a day-to-day basis? Those kinds of stories were a part of what people were sharing. And I really appreciated that kind of ability or willingness to go to the heart of matters in every possible way. I was a little overwhelmed, to tell you the truth, as some of the stories came in, and I was going, wow, I don't think I could share that deeply.
And how long did it take you to compile the interviews?
4 years.
4 years?
Yes. And that was in between, you see, because I was interested and I didn't know how long it was going to take, but at the same time I was beginning my life as a published poet, so having to do a lot of writing and submitting in that area, and also writing my master's thesis, which I got in 2005. So when I was kind of tired of the academic side of things and didn't have much to say for the thesis, I would take a break and write to a friend and say, by the way, did you finish anything that you wanted to share for my book? And they might or might not respond right away. Another time, or I would call somebody and say, let's do that interview now. And when I didn't have anything much to do on the book, I might just hope for the inspiration of poems. So I was doing 3 writing projects at a time, and which is actually what I'm doing now as well, and trying to hang out as much as possible with my kids and my husband, and, having a life.
Yeah, right. So how long ago was the book published?
Just this fall, October.
Fall. Okay, so it's a recent publication.
Yes. Yes, it's quite a wonderful thing for somebody who's always wanted to write, to hold her first book in her hands, and actually my second has now been accepted, so I seem to be on a little bit of a roll.
That's good.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned also that you're a published poet.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about what you've published?
Well, sure. A few years back, when I was still working at the Maxwell International Baha'i School on Vancouver Island, I was sitting late at night, and I suppose I was in some kind of a meditative state, and some impulse, I thought, I used to write poems, and I had used to write poems, nothing that I had attempted to publish, but I just wrote down in one take a poem called Trinity. And then I thought, well, maybe this is worth something. I mean, it expressed something I had wanted to try and say. And the next day I went into the Maxwell Library, and there's actually a magazine from the United States. It's a wonderful magazine. It's called World Order that the Baha'is publish. And so I just sent it off to them, and then I forgot about it. And a couple of years later, after I had moved east, I got an email from somebody saying, World Order's looking for you. And so I emailed them, and they wanted to publish my poem. And I thought, how lovely. That was encouraging, and so I sent them some more, and they actually have published more and have more that they are going to publish. And then I thought, well, I should start submitting to secular magazines. And so during the time that I was doing my master's work, which I started in 2002, I encountered a really quite wonderful professor. I think that happens to people, is somewhere along the line there's someone you can thank, there's a teacher you can thank, kind of thing. And she was teaching a course called Poetry of Witness, which was based in a text that I just absolutely adore. It's called Against Forgetting. And it's edited by Carolyn Forche, who's just a wonderful American poet. And she had gathered an anthology of poems from the 20th century which had to do with various themes of political upheaval. So, you had Anna Akhmatova from Russia, for example, writing during the revolution, or later you would have had poets like Amiria Baraka writing during the Vietnam era, and she had gathered this into this wonderful anthology. And I ended up doing a seminar, very, very long seminar, in my naivete, way too long, on Pablo Neruda's work from Latin America. And also studying a number of Canadian women poets. And I think what happens as a writer is when you're being inspired by the people you're reading, you also end up just feeling that inclination to write. And so I began submitting, and I have now been publishing in several literary magazines here in Canada, in addition to World Order in the States, and have just returned, actually, from a writer's retreat. It's called a Master Poets Retreat that's run on Vancouver Island at an old nunnery called Glenairlie, where Patrick Lane is a mentor to poets who are at various stages of their poetic careers. And we were 17 poets gathered for 4 days, just going through that process of learning more about the muse and the genre, and having somebody who is a multiply published poet and a winner of what we call here our Governor General's Awards, which is something very special. I suppose any poet who is publishing really may not aspire specifically to awards, but if you get one of those, it's a kind of Canada saying you're great. Mm-hmm. So it was quite a special thing for me, and there are a number of publications. Leaf Press is one of my favorites. You can look it up online.
Can you spell it?
LEAF Press.
Okay.
It's www.leafpress.com. And what happens with poems, of course, is that it takes a little while to get known and to get anthologized, but there are many independent little presses like that, and so typically they'll produce anything, could be what they call a chap book, or could be little booklets, which might be as much as 40 pages or so. And when you go into, in our country, it's chapters. I imagine there you've got Barnes & Noble and Borders and all these kinds of stores. There's always a poetry section, and you'll have anthologies, but you'll also have these books that have been produced by a poet of a particular, several presses, and in Canada we have maybe 4 or 5. So that's the stage of my poetry that I'm at, as having been published in several journals and hoping to now put together my first actual manuscript. I have a lot of poems, but it's an editorial process. Mm-hmm.
So tell me about the first poem you mentioned, Trinity.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was quite simple. I was looking at trees. There were trees. In fact, my daughter was recently in Vancouver Island, and she came to me and said, Mom, they cut those trees down from the poem. But I just had a fancy, and I did a couple of allusions in the poem, one of them to Whitman. I never got to study Walt Whitman at university, which was kind of funny because I kind of wanted to go back to university to be able to do that. But with a master's program and, of course, doctoral programs, you always end up having to select from what's being offered by the experts at the time, and there's a lot more being done in the 20th century or the 16th century, but not a whole lot of 19th century stuff, and even there I didn't get a chance. But however, I said, who doesn't love Whitman? Mm-hmm. So that was what I knew to allude to, and it was just a kind of a muse in the night.
Mm. So how long is the poem?
Oh, it's 1 page. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, if there are aspiring poets listening, I should tell them my experience of the last few years in terms of moving into the poetic world is that most, not all, but most literary journals tend to prefer shorter poems, and there are some conspicuous exceptions. One of them is in Canada called the Malahat Review, which every second year does a contest for the long poem, and actually one of our Canadian authors who's probably well known to many Americans is a man named Michael Ondaatje. He wrote a book called The English Patient, which was made into a movie that a lot of people are familiar with.
I just read that book recently.
Well, there you go. Well, Michael is one of the people who has put together the long poem anthologies, so there is a genre for people who write longer and narrative-type poems often, but usually literary journals want stuff that will fit onto a page or perhaps too, unless they specify otherwise. So they're the little tricks of the trade that you learn in the process, eh? I think that's the first time that I said "a" in this whole interview. I get teased about that because I've been working with people in Chicago as a result of publishing Partners in Spirit, and one of the people has been teasing me about my Canadian propensity to say "a," but I think that's the first time it slipped.
Oh, that's very good. Very good.
I'm not sure, though.
Well, I'll find out when I go over the interview.
Sure.
So you said you have a book, another book you've completed but not published?
Yes.
Can you tell me anything about it?
I sure can.
All right.
It's called A Warm Place in My Heart. It's also being published by a Baha'i publisher, but not in the United States. This one's called George Ronald, and they're out of England, out of the UK. And again, I used the interview process, but I did not do what I had done in Partners, which was to put a lot of my own commentary. In this book, I asked the question of young people. I'm using the term young somewhat loosely because they were ages 13 to about 30, who practiced the Baha'i faith, why they would do that. And quite frankly, I did it because I don't think it's easy to practice a faith, any faith, in a fairly secular age, but in particular, the Baha'i teachings do have high standards with respect to certain elements of life, including, for example, we're not meant to drink alcohol or take drugs. And this is a culture which accepts at least alcohol as a kind of a normal form of life, and so people who choose not to drink or to drug or a number of other things, let alone having a prayer life, we have obligatory prayer, these kinds of things are not necessarily easy for people, and for young people in particular, I was thinking, what is it about Baha'i teaching that would attract you to wanting to commit yourself to a faith that requires very high standards? And my eldest daughter had made the comment to me, Mom, adults don't get youth voices right. And I don't know if it's always true, but it seemed to me that it was probably true, and I had studied during my master's work this whole idea of appropriation, of taking on someone else's voice, which some novelists do very, very successfully, but which perhaps is not so easy to do. So I thought, well, I think the best way to get around that is I'm genuinely interested in why young people believe and the struggles that they have in doing so, and how does that implicate for them the choices that they make, and what does faith mean for a young Baha'i? And I ended up interviewing, I have a couple more of the interviews still coming in, but it's about 30 people from around the world, and simply writing an introduction and then I edited all of them, of course, but not so much for content as much for just making sure the English was well done or that it was clear and so forth. And that book is the one that has been accepted for publication next.
Mm-hmm. And when do you anticipate it being released?
I'm guessing it'll be at least a year, but it could be as long as 18 months to 2 years based on precedent. By the time you do all the editing process of a book, it just astonished me. I've been on a pretty steep learning curve here, and you can finish a book, but until the publisher says we're going to bring it out at such and such a time, it basically sits and waits. Mm-hmm. And then when they do bring it out, there's quite a bit of push to get it into good shape, and the cover picture, the things chosen that go with it, and where it's going to be marketed, and those kinds of things.
Are you allowed to give us the title?
Well, I hope so.
Okay.
Certainly, on the last book, I had a different title, but they suggested the Partners in Spirit one, and I could understand the rationale, so I accepted it. Mm-hmm. This one, so far, my title is A Warm Place in My Heart, but it's not actually my title in the sense that I didn't say it. It's an excerpt from a quotation by Shoghi Effendi, who was the guardian of our faith during a period of time, and he wrote something in 1929 about youth in which he said that they held a warm place in his heart. And since I, too, as a teacher, have had the experience of holding a warm place in my heart for young people, well, and for people in general, because some of us just grow older, but we still have young hearts. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it seemed appropriate, and I hope that the publishers will agree when the time comes, but we haven't started that conversation yet.
Right. Do you have another book in the works?
I do.
Okay.
My third book is for the Baha'i, from a Baha'i perspective. I have also a couple of poetry anthologies that I'm working on, and one creative nonfiction, as yet untitled. But the Baha'i series, the third one, is somewhat loosely based on the format of the first one. Again, I'm interviewing people, and I'm still in process with the interviews. What I'm finding, of course, is when you already have one book published and one book out, people respond more quickly than they did with the first one, where it was kind of nebulous. But this one is about the only other area I feel like I have any real legitimate commentary to be able to share, and that is in education. So I'm tentatively titling this one, Hidden Mysteries, Educators Speak from Heart and Spirit. And I have almost all of the first chapter done. I have 3 interviews that have come in for that, and I have the outline done, and I have probably a little bit written in half of it. So I'm giving myself maybe a 6-month time frame to have enough to be able to offer it to Baha'i Publishing, who have first dibs by contract on my work now.
Mm-hmm. You said you had a couple of non-Baha'i works in progress?
Yes. I have one manuscript, which I don't know if the American listeners are familiar with public radio, but here, probably so.
Oh, yeah.
And here in Canada, our CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, is in fact a public radio company, which thus is really encouraging, generally speaking, of the arts. And there's an annual competition both for prose and poetry, and last year one of my manuscripts shortlisted on that. So that has encouraged me to work on that manuscript a bit more. It's called Close to Being Holy. Another manuscript that I'm fooling around with is tentatively called Here and There, which isn't very profound, but in fact I started thinking about post-colonial issues which had occurred during the time that I was doing my studies, and so I think the Here section is going to be some of the commentary that I've made from living as a North American, and the There part will be more from my travels overseas, particularly in Belize. I spent quite a bit of time in Belize.
When was that?
Oh, I probably first went there in 1979, and then later again 2 or 3 times, and most recently I took my kids and we went on a 6-week summer journey to Belize, Honduras, and Guatemala. I wanted my kids to, and my dear husband was home working for us, but we flew first to Belize, and then we took buses throughout Guatemala and Honduras. I have brother-in-law, 2 actually, who are from Honduras, and so one of them met us, and we just had a really kind of an insider's touristic view. It was quite dramatic and remarkable, and whenever you have something of that nature, you end up writing, I think, as a writer. And one of the poems that World Order magazine has accepted, is a poem called In Gloria's Garden. And Gloria was one of my hostesses in Honduras, and I wrote quite a long poem about my travels in Central America, and so that one I expect will be in print in the next year or so.
Well, Heather, thank you very much.
It's my pleasure, Tim. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about why my books are out there.
Great, and best of luck to you.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Heather Cardin, a Baha'i and author of the book Partners in Spirit, What Couples Say About Marriages That Work. For a copy of this and other interviews, you're welcome to go to the website www.abahaiperspective.com. For information specifically on the Baha'i Faith, you can go to the website www.baha'i.org, or you can call the toll-free number 1-800-22-UNITE.